I've been sitting on these stories for years. They live in the same place in my head as the sound of gravel under tires at midnight, the metallic groan of an old gate, the smell of a house that's been left to rot. I'm in my 30s now, but all three of these nights happened when I was a teenager, stupid, certain I was braver than I was, convinced curiosity was its own kind of courage. 3 separate nights, 3 moments I still replay when I should be sleeping. I should put something up front. I don't tell these to glorify what we did. We trespassed. It was reckless. I don't recommend anyone go hunting for these places. I'm telling this because the memory still sits heavy, because each of these stories has details that make the explanation slippery, plausible but not neat. Multiple people saw what I saw. We smelled it, we heard it, and a lot of the time we ran a lot faster than we expected to. The first one starts in a car that shouldn't have held that many kids, and a map scribbled on the back of someone's jacket. It was senior spring, the kind of night where air is warm enough to keep the windows down, and we convinced ourselves the world felt invincible. Alex was driving his old Subaru, black, dent in the rear from the time he misjudged a mailbox. Nick was in the front seat, headphones off, doing that thing where he hummed under his breath like it made him less nervous. Scott was in the back, leg bouncing, a flashlight jammed under his arm like a talisman. I remember the clock on the dash read close to midnight by the time we turned onto the dirt road, leading to what people called the old military village. The village was a Cold War leftover, rows of identical houses, a small church, a square of community buildings, all fenced off and supposed to be condemned. Stories about it slid around town like oil, broken doors, squatters, a local claim that you could still hear music if the wind hit the church a certain way. Nothing official ever stuck to paper because it was one of those places that existed in rumor. The fence had been cut in one place for years. Kids had shoved through there before us. That was how you found your way in, through half-closed gates under no trespassing signs. People called it haunted, but mostly it was a challenge. 2 minutes of adrenaline, a story to one-up the next guy. We did not go for a ghost. We went because it was there, because we were seniors who had homework and jobs, and a kind of boredom that begged to be burned away. We convinced ourselves we'd be in and out in an hour. We were wrong. The approach was a slow crawl. Overgrown pines boxed the lane, branches clawing at the windows like hands trying to pry something loose. The Subaru's headlights cut a path through low fog that seemed to come off the ground instead of the trees, a thin mist that smelled faintly like sump water and old leaves. We parked where the ground flattened, pushed the gate aside. One of us had to lift the chain and shove it enough for the car to pass, and then shut the engine off like we were trying to hide from sound itself. You could hear the crickets, and underneath them, a different kind of hum. The town had a hum like pipes left on. The houses were smaller than I expected. 2-bed, 1-bath row houses, paint long since bled into wood grain, porches rotten and slanting. Spray paint scarred nearly every surface with tags and crude jokes. The church sat on a slight rise, its steeple collapsed at the roofline, the cross crooked. For a second the whole place could have been a movie set, too cinematic to be real, but the small, concrete things made it real. A child's bicycle lay half-buried under a privet hedge. A swing hung from a rusted chain in a yard, frozen mid-arc. A tile from a bathroom had been dragged into the street, white against the dark. We split up because that's what you do when you want more ground covered and less of a group conscience. Alex and I circled toward the church. Nick and Scott went into a row of houses, flashing lights through windows like they were doing a living room raid. I remember the church door was jammed. You could see inside through the glass. Pews tipped or half-burned. Hymnals scattered like dry leaves on the platform. Dust making everything soft. The air at the threshold smelled like old incense and mouse droppings. It was quiet in a way that makes you notice the small noises, the distant drip of water, the whisper of a loose section of metal on the roof, the soft click of Alex's flashlight as he adjusted its beam. We were talking in low voices, because the dark makes you stupidly reverent. I stepped into the nave, shoes chilling on cold tiles, and there was a part of me that expected something to be theatrically wrong, candles still lit, that sort of thing. There was nothing like that. There were, however, small signs of recent presence that didn't fit the overnight ghost story. A plastic cup on the altar rim, a shoe shoved under a pew, footprints in the dust that were fresh enough to disturb the pattern. We weren't alone. Not that I say we saw someone right away. My memory is stubborn about the small things. At first it was a shadow on the far side of a keyhole-shaped window. It bunched, then stretched, like someone leaning in and out of the glass. Alex swore it was just a trick of moonlight, that our eyes were playing games. Nick radioed over the flashlight that he'd seen a figure move between a row of houses outside, and for a moment we all became very, very small people in a very large place. There's a kind of hush that settles before panic does. It's different from silence, it's permission. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if anything happened, this would also make a good story for later. The theatre, the cadence of how I'd tell it, the exact words to get the audience leaning in. That foolish calculation lasted a breath, and then the world contracted to a single wrong movement. We heard footsteps. Not those casual, noisy boots you get from city kids, but the soft, deliberate tread of someone who didn't want to be heard. They came from outside, scraping along the church siding, then a sound at the window that made the light tremble. An unnatural silhouette passed, tall, angular, and then another sound, something moving like a fabric catching on a nail. For a second, only a second, there was a sense of being watched by something very close. We backed toward the door like thieves, realizing the owner had returned. The sprint to the car is the part that replays like a cutscene. We ran. My legs remembered the exact betrayal of youth. The first stride so fast your knees forgot where to go and the ground felt too close. I don't remember who started shouting. Maybe Alex, maybe me. We all reached the Subaru at once, breath loud in the open air, flashlights clutched like weapons. We fumbled with the locks. The key trembled in my hand. My hand remembers that tremor as if it's a separate person. When we threw open the back door, that's when she was there. She was tall, taller than any of us expected to see. She stood half-slung into the back seat as if attempting to climb in, one leg tucked like she was in the motion of sitting. She wore an old black dress that didn't belong to anyone we might bump into in a country town. No hoodie or jeans, but an antique cut, long-sleeved and thin at the edges. Her hair was long and dark, hanging like wet rope. I remember the way the dress pulled at her ankles, fabric that shouldn't have moved in the wind but did. For a heartbeat I thought it was a homeless person trying to escape the cold, an explanation that made my throat ease for a second, until she turned. She didn't turn like someone turning to speak. She turned like a hinge. Her face was pale, the sort of thinness that reads like a map of years of bad luck. There were lines around her mouth and eyes, not just the usual, crow's feet and worry, but a map of something older. She didn't have the look of a young tramp or a kid in a costume. She had the brake-squeal silence of something that had been stopped and left. Her lips parted, and she made this soft sound, less a word and more a wet, moist whisper, and it landed on the air between us like an accusation. She did not say, "Please," or "Help me." She made a sound that meant attention, that pulled a string inside your chest. Alex shouted. It might even have been him who slammed the Subaru into drive because there was nothing else to do. The car lurched, tires spun on loose gravel. A lamppost somewhere in the village banged like it had been struck by an unseen fist. In the rear view, I watched the woman's head tilt and then see her step away from the car, as if she had been pretending to climb in until she realized we weren't dark figures willing to do whatever was asked. She moved like someone who had been waiting out of habit, and when she turned back toward the church, she didn't run. She crossed the yard in a way that made me so certain she would enter the church that I swear the world paused a fraction. We didn't stop until the streetlights were a strip of gold behind us. Alex swore under his breath, and we nearly sideswiped a mailbox, which is the part of the night I still feel like a fool about, so close to injury from adrenaline. We drove as fast as we dared, which was not very fast, because the roads were narrow, and the Subaru didn't belong to a stunt driver. We didn't speak much. The radio came on at some point, a cheap pop song to cover whatever song had been playing in our heads. Later, in the light of sober morning, the rational explanations lined up like dominoes. Maybe it was a homeless woman. Maybe she was a trespasser who had been living in the church for months. Maybe she had been startled by us, and the way she moved made us read menace into every gesture. We told ourselves that, and if I'm honest, I believed it some of the time. But there were things that didn't fit. First, there were the footprints. Not only were there fresh prints in the dust near the altar, there were prints outside the church that led in long arcs as if someone had been pacing the yard, and then a set of prints that headed straight for the Subaru and stopped very close to the back door. The prints didn't match a woman in a long dress. They were long and narrow, almost like the tracks of someone who was careful with their feet. Second, when we went back with flashlights an hour later, stupid, I know. Neither one of us is proud of the second trip. They'd boarded up the side door of the church with fresh planks, nails still sticking out. That wasn't there the first time we were inside. We didn't see anyone hammering them. We drove by the fence and checked at a distance. The village had an emptier look in the blue of pre-dawn, like all of its secrets had been scrubbed away. Years later, I drove out with someone who knew the area better and discovered the village had been bulldozed. There were photographs online of cement slabs and bulldozer tracks, a municipal press release about safety and remediation. The church was gone. The porches that had made soft shadow prisons were nowhere. Friends I grew up with said the place had been cleaned up in the late 2000s. Records showed demolition permits. But asked about the woman, the town's memories were thin. People told me it could have been squatters. A woman with mental illness, a joke gone wrong. No one had a memory of a tall woman in a black dress at 1 a.m., in a Subaru pulling out with kids who'd seen something they couldn't easily name. We never went back. For a long time, the night lived on in a pocket in my head, reserved for other people's mistakes. Sometimes I'd hear a song with a minor key, and my chest would do that little jump you get when the old adrenaline thinks it still has a place at the table. Alex and I stopped making jokes about who could stay in the most haunted place. Nick told the story at parties and got a laugh, because he always ended it with a self-deprecating line. Turns out courage is just poor planning and cheap insurance. Scott swore he'd seen the woman too, and when he told the story, he would get this look, half embarrassed, half sheepish, like he'd been tricked by the dark into doing something more daring than he actually was. If there was a lesson, it was supposed to be obvious. Don't go into places you shouldn't. A more honest lesson was that the world is complicated, and sometimes events sit between two explanations without choosing one. The woman might have been human. She might not have been. We had multiple witnesses, 4 of us whose memories aligned on shape and movement, and that is one of those small comforts that doesn't actually comfort you. Validation doesn't always equal resolution. Anyway, if you're the kind of person who likes these sorts of stories, if the crackle of abandoned houses and thin, stupid bravery speaks to you, subscribe and stick around. That was the first night. There are 2 more that, if anything, get stranger. The second story starts with a different tone, less a dare than a hobby. My girlfriend then, Hannah, had taken to exploring abandoned houses the way some people take to birdwatching, slow, methodical, with a notebook and an appetite for details nobody else seemed to care about. She liked the history of it. She liked the idea that a place could hold its past like a scent. She had a way of looking at boarded windows and thinking of a room's last birthday. It was quieter than the military village trip, at least in purpose. Where our group had been loud and performative, Hannah went for a study in quiet. The house we picked that night was out past the county line, a 2-story home that sat back from the road behind a line of pines. Often these places crop up where forgotten things gather, a stretch of real estate someone lost interest in, a mortgage that got complicated, the weight of an old life dropped like a suitcase. The property had been marked for condemnation on a county notice posted months earlier. Plywood had been nailed across the front door in big, angry X's. Someone had kicked one section loose, apparently, because the inside smelled of dry rot and something else. Old milk, sour and sharp. We parked a little way off the lane, leaving the headlights pointed toward the trees. Hannah took her backpack, the one with the worn straps and 3 pockets, and reached for a crowbar she'd borrowed from my dad. There's a subtext here, I should note. We were young and we rationalized break-ins as investigation. We said we were documenting neglect. We said the houses deserved to be seen. We were right, and we were wrong. The front step complained under our shoes. Inside the living room was a postcard for abandonment, a coffee table half buried under a pile of newspapers, faded to a grey like old skin, an armchair with a gash down its back like an animal had gnawed something raw. There was a giant hole in the floor, as if a section of the upstairs had given up its support and one day simply dropped through. You could peer into the dark like a well and see the shadow of the crawl space below. Hannah shone her flashlight into that place and found, among the dust and the thin ancient cobwebs, items that don't belong in a house nobody cares for anymore. A child's plastic cup, a small stuffed bear with one eye missing, a rolled stack of what looked like disposable diapers or baby wipes tucked under a joist. "Someone lived here recently," Hannah said. Her voice was flat with both curiosity and the kind of disappointment you get when a story's richer than your villain. She peered into a bedroom on the second floor that still had a child's sticker chart on the wall. There was a crib frame with rust and rope where a mattress had been. In the attic hatch, something had been left open like a mouth. We moved cautiously because the floorboards groaned in a way that made your entire body listen. The house seemed to breathe through its faults. We found a dining room with chairs pushed back like someone left a meal mid-bite. On a mantel sat a framed photograph. The black and white surface cracked along the woman's face in the picture. Someone had tried to scrape the glass, maybe, or it had split in a freeze. In the kitchen, the sink still had a film of standing water that threw back our flashlight beams in greenish glints. There was no electricity, yet small signs of habitation, tucked among the ruin, suggested that a person could have been squatting here somewhere not long before. We didn't expect to find someone awake. The kind of person who lives in these places tends to avoid confrontation, so it had that extra smallness when we heard the slow, rhythmic creak, like a knee joint, like a grandfather clock pushed by an invisible hand, coming from the closed-off parlor at the back of the house. It sounded like a rocking chair moving back and forth. We froze. Hannah looked at me with an expression I could not read that night. Part of me wanted to check the sound out, because Hannah's hobby made the idea of an encounter seem like a natural extension of the research. Part of me wanted to back out, leave the house to whatever socks of civilization had tangled this place up. We moved toward the parlor because Hannah moved, because she had this inexorable patience for detail. She eased the door open, and a hinge shrieked like an animal. Inside the parlor it was dim, and the curtains box-shuttered blocked the moonlight in ragged sections. There was a single chair in the center, a high-backed rocker upholstered in floral cloth, with the pattern faded into ghostly roses. The chair faced away from the window, toward a small television set that had been left on a stand like a relic. There was dust in the air, catching Hannah's flashlight beam, motes floating like ghosts of insulation. The rocking chair moved a little, an inch forward and back, and the sound of it seemed enormous in the tiny room. For a second I thought, because my brain was being helpful, that someone had been there earlier and had stepped out, and the chair was still settling. That was the simplest explanation. My muscles relaxed a millimeter. Then the rocking stopped, and there was a soft hum, like someone singing under their breath. It was tuneless, a private melody. The hair on my forearms rose in small prickly lines. Hannah moved closer to the chair, her flashlight steady. "Hello?" she said once. It was a small, careful hello, not a demand, the way you talk to an animal you don't want to frighten. The air felt colder near the chair, as if the upholstery had been pumping cold out like it had a memory of winter. The hum stopped. The house exhaled. We didn't see anyone at first. Then, as if peeled from a stage set, the back of the chair shifted, as if someone had been seated and had very slowly turned their head. The pace was wrong, not like a quick glance, but like muscle memory after a tremor, delayed and measured, like the person rotating with caution. The movement showed a profile, thin hair caught against the light, a slouch that spoke of old age or exhaustion. My instinct was to step back. If I'd been alone, I might have done it for the safety of my own rationalization. If I leave, I can't be proven wrong about what I didn't see. Being with Hannah stopped me from rationalizing. She laughed first, a nervous, small laugh that sounded too loud in the room. "Okay," she said, in that sleep-deprived, bored tone that makes things worse. "Person in the chair, you scared the hell out of us. Come on, we're not monsters." The laugh worked for 2 seconds, and then broke. The chair shifted again. The profile turned more. For 1/100th of a second I glimpsed a face that wasn't a face I recognized from the region. It was wrinkled and close to the cloth, like something that had been stitched into the pattern and forgotten. The eyes, God, the eyes were cavernous, ringed with shadow. The mouth was small and thin, aware and yet slack with the fatigue of long occupancy. She, or he, it looked like an old woman, made that same soft singing sound, and then stopped. Hannah, who had spent the last 15 minutes cataloguing each floorboard, cataloguing each gash in the wallpaper, catalogued this the same way. "Maybe someone still lives here," she said, voice pitched low. I wanted to believe her because belief was less noisy than the ache that built in my chest. But the front door that we had come through had been freshly nailed. The boarded windows had seen new screws. The hole in the floor had been there as a hazard, the crawl space under it swooped like a throat. Who was able to sit in that chair? Who would be humming in a house that had been condemned? Hannah stepped closer, and there was a faint sour smell like old milk and the metallic tang of rust. The chair tilted back a fraction too far and then forward, as if someone shifted weight. For a moment, I believed we'd find an old woman, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide but alive and human, and I pictured us all apologizing and making plans to call someone, or at least to leave quietly and let her sleep. But then, right as I was imagining the apology, something else happened that made my legs remember how to run. We heard a small movement from the ceiling above the chair, like someone had tapped a cane against the floorboards upstairs. It was quick, a knock, and then the light in the hallway outside the parlor flashed as if someone had hit the switch and then missed it. A shadow passed across the crack of the doorframe, something too big to be the woman in the chair, and everything in me went cold. Hannah's laugh died. She took my hand without asking, and squeezed like she needed proof that whatever courage she had was still attached to me. We backed away slowly, the way you step away from a snake, eyes fixed on the chair. The rocking chair stopped moving altogether, and the hum turned into nothing but pressure. For a second I felt like the house itself was watching me. Weird, I know, but that was the sensation. And then the parlor door slammed shut so hard the house shivered. We didn't go back upstairs. We left the way we came, more frantic now because the slamming was a punctuation mark. On the porch, the air hit our faces and tasted like rain, and somewhere behind us, a window rattled. We ran to the car and didn't speak until we were down the lane, tires singing on gravel. Hannah's fingers never left mine the whole drive home. In the weeks after, Hannah insisted on going back in daylight, on bringing gloves and a notebook and a camera. She wanted to check the property records, to see when the house had last been occupied, to speak to neighbors. We found records that listed the property as vacant for years, but on a neighbor's porch, a woman with a white headscarf told us in a voice the size of a whisper that an old lady had lived there once, years ago, one with grandchildren who visited in the summer. The neighbor shook her head and said, "No way someone like that'd be sitting there now. That house got the kind of cold that takes people away." The house was gone months later, demolished and hauled like a secret no one wanted. Pictures of the rubble made it look small, like a little pile of forgetfulness. Once again, we had an absence where a presence had been. Hannah would sometimes, when we lay awake, hum that stupid tune she thought she'd heard and ask me if I thought she was crazy. I told her I didn't know. Part of me liked that we had something between us that sounded like reason, and part of me hated that an old melody in a house could make me feel small. And that could have been the end of the string if not for the way this kept accumulating. Odd, unresolved things stacking on top of each other like unclaimed boxes. The third event takes place not in a collapsed house with a rocking chair, but in a place that was once ordinary. My family moved into a nicer house, a normal suburban thing with hedges and a garage, and next door there lived a man who was the kind of neighbor every neighborhood seems to manufacture. He was mean in the low-level ways that make your days textured with irritation. He would stand on his porch and shout at kids for using the sidewalk, hang old election signs in his yard long after the election, and once he came over to yell at my brother because the basketball had bounced onto his lawn. He had the type of face that made you keep your head down and the type of door that stayed shut the way a cave's mouth stays closed. People talked about him like you talk about the weather. This is the neighbor you don't want, and we accepted him as a fixed variable. One night, he didn't open his door for days. Then he didn't open it for a week. Then someone called the police because the mail kept piling up, and the curtains were the same every morning. They found him. He'd died in his armchair, the kind of death that didn't fit neat narrative. They took him away in a body bag. I won't go into details because there's no point and it's not what this is about. The house became what empty houses often become, frozen in time. No one touched a single item on the counters. The TV was still flicked to the same channel. The milk got moldy in the fridge. The place smelled like a threshold. When a house is left like a paused life, it becomes an invitation. Boys will find ways to look through windows. People will dare. People will discover how quiet things can be when the windows are closed and the world moves on without you. My friend Joel came over one night after the funeral. He'd been around town and had heard the rumors. The house being cleared out, the son coming back and taking things. We were stupid enough to make a plan. We'd break in like kids, see how the world looked in someone else's paws. We climbed through a basement window because the door had a chain lock, and we thought windows were safer. The smell hit us first, antiseptic and rot, and that inescapable hush of a life ended. We walked through rooms that had been frozen in the middle of minor routines. The table set with a napkin, a mug on the windowsill, a newspaper folded at the pages that announced nothing spectacular. You don't really understand how a place can preserve someone's last habits until you stand where they did. On the mantel there was a clock stopped at 3:30. The shoes sat by the door, as if the man had planned to go somewhere in the morning, and then simply didn't. We joked to cover the strangeness. "He always hated kids on the sidewalk," Joel said, half laughing. "Guess he got one last piece of quiet." Later that night we were sitting in my bedroom with one of those cheap radio scanners Joel loved to fiddle with, when we heard a slow knock on the back of the house. It was rhythmic. 3, then a pause, like someone testing a pattern. At first we thought it was the wind or some loose shutter. Then we heard it again, steady and patient, and it lined up with the kitchen window of the old man's house. We all walked to the window and stood there watching. In the yellow cast of the porch light, the old man's living room window held a silhouette. Not detailed, just a dark mass against a lighter background, but it shifted. I saw it move from the doorway toward the window in a way that suggested a person crossing the room. Joel breathed out, and his breath fogged the glass. It was one of those shared moments where your body understands what your brain won't say, that you are witnessing something outside the ordinary. "Maybe some kid messing around," I said, because saying anything else felt like admitting the shape of my fear. But the silhouette's motion had a slowness to it. It wasn't the hurried gait of a kid trying to avoid being seen. It was careful. It stopped at the window, and then with a motion like shrugging off sleep it seemed to dissolve, melt into the glass and be gone. We all saw it. Joel swore he saw the figure step back and the window shade fall for a brief second as if someone had closed it. We stayed up the rest of the night because once you've seen that kind of thing, you refuse to give it the satisfaction of a private memory. We sat in the dark, like sentries, watching the house across the way as if our vigilance could keep whatever had moved in there from moving again. Joel kept fiddling with the scanner and laughed too loud every time the static spit at us. We were shamelessly childish about it, but underneath the jokes was a thrum of something else. Validation. Multiple witnesses make things harder to dismiss, and I think there's a peculiar cruelty to that. The world gets stranger when more than one person refuses to be the lonely reporter of a freak occurrence. Weeks later, the old man's son returned. He was younger than you might expect for the son of an elderly neighbor, lean with that air of someone who inherited anger alongside furniture. He cleared the house, loaded boxes into a van, and took things away. When he came over to shake our hands, he gave us a look that was less grateful and more like a man who knew what he was losing and hated it for being taken from him. He didn't talk about the silhouette. He didn't acknowledge that anyone saw anything. He sold the place eventually, and new people moved in with new lives and new trash cans and new routines. The house looked ordinary again under the season's paint. But sometimes late at night, I'll catch myself at the window and look across at the row of houses and wonder about thresholds, the way a place holds a life after that life is gone. There's a residue to human habit, a scent on a chair, a pair of shoes, a clock stopped at the time the heart stopped. That residue makes explanations messy. Was it grief? Was it a neighbor with a weird habit? Was it something else? I don't know. I can only tell you that we were 4 boys who saw a silhouette cross a room and vanish, and that memory is as stubborn as any fact. Right now, at this point, where I'm telling you these 3 stories out of order and in pieces. I'm thinking about how each of them hinges on the same odd thing, an uncanny presence in places left behind. The military village woman in the black dress, the rocking chair we found humming in a condemned house, the silhouette that moved across the old neighbor's window. Each of them is small and specific and refuses to be made tidy. There's more to tell. The second story has a part that doesn't fit any of the comfortable explanations Hannah and I tried to give it, and the third story has a moment that makes me reconsider what validation from friends actually buys you. But those parts need pace. They deserve the shape of the night the way the first story did, and I think you're starting to sense how my head keeps rewinding these clips, watching them for a new angle. I should stop for a second and say again, don't take this as an instruction. These places were dangerous, physically and legally, and we were lucky more than once that the price of our curiosity was only fear and not something worse. If you're hearing this at 2 in the morning and thinking, this would be a fun thing to try, don't. That's not courage. That's an invitation. There's a difference between curiosity and the kind of stupidity that gets you hurt. When we come back, I'll finish the second story. I'll tell you about the thing that made Hannah stop turning the house into a hobby, and the one detail that makes me think her humming wasn't a human habit. And the third story? I'll tell you about the night after the sun moved back in. The one time Joel and I swore the house itself seemed to know we were looking. I still dream about certain moments. I still wake up with the sound of a chair that might have been empty, creaking somewhere in the dark. For now, let the first story sit with you, an image of a Subaru and a woman in a black dress, and the sudden, terrible clarity of teenagers who realize they are out of their depth. Let that press on the bones of your imagination. There is more, and it gets stranger. We came back in daylight like idiots who think sunlight makes everything sensible. Hannah brought work gloves and a small handheld camera like a journalist on a hobby budget. She wanted records. She wanted to know dates and names and whether anyone had the legal right to be in that house at all. I wanted to prove my nerves weren't made of tissue. We walked the perimeter first, because that felt safer. Cautious steps, the soft tap of sneakers on rotted boards. Someone had driven a stake into the yard and looped bright caution tape around the mailbox. The plywood across the front door had been screwed in tighter, new screws, raw wood that smelled sharp. Inside, daylight didn't help so much as it changed the color of everything. The parlor was less theatrical in sun. Instead of floating dust motes, it was 1,000 little grains that looked like the remains of other people's lives. The rocking chair sat exactly where we'd left it, though the fabric didn't seem the same color in the morning. Hannah crouched and ran gloved fingers along the armrests. There was a faint ring, like where someone's elbow had sat for a long time. She reached to the seat and with a look I still remember, the look that is half triumph, half horror, she brushed a clean arc through the dust. There were small prints along the rug. Not full shoe prints, but scuffs, as if something had shuffled from the doorway toward the center and then back again. The dust on the seat had a crescent cleared away, as if a palm or a face had been dragged there and removed. Hannah photographed everything, clicking with a devotion that was almost tender. She even took a picture of the faded hymn sheet stuck between the couch cushion and the armrest. She was methodical. She labeled files with dates. She made a spreadsheet of oddities. She was the kind of person who believed paperwork could reduce mystery to a problem. We found nothing living. No blanket under the couch, no pile of cans with sharp teeth marks, no makeshift bedding in the attic. There were no cigarette butts, no smokes that would suggest an active squatter. There were, however, traces that didn't line up. In the crawl space, the diapers we'd seen were soggy and compressed as if they'd been sat on rather than simply discarded. In the nursery, a sticker chart had one column ticked in a child's hand, another's blank, like someone had started keeping track and then stopped. It was the particular shape of abandonment that got under your skin, a life interrupted without tidy explanation. Then Hannah said, "Look." She held up her gloved hand, and between the thumb and index finger was a tiny scrap of paper. It was frayed, stained, and folded into something no one would find by accident. She hadn't taken anything. She hadn't been up to the attic yet. The scrap had a few bars of melody printed on it, crude and smudged. The tune was simple. I recognized it once she hummed it under her breath, the same way you remember a song you half heard on a TV. It was the melody we'd heard that night, the one that had sounded like a private lullaby. "How the hell did this get here?" she asked. Her voice had the edge that meant curiosity had turned to something a little colder. We argued about taking it. She pocketed it anyway, careful as someone who had found the wrong thing in a footlocker. Later she scanned it and put it in her folder. She wrote "humming paper" on the caption, like a question that matured into a problem. It should have been the last oddity in a field of small explainable things. It wasn't. That night back at her apartment, Hannah slept badly. I was at my place, but she called me at 2 in the morning, voice thin. "I woke up humming," she said. I was humming it, and I didn't know how to stop. I tried to make a joke, it didn't work. There was a stupid private embarrassment in all of it, like being the only person who laughed at the wrong moment in a funeral. But there was also a sinking feeling that something had found its way into the part of her that you don't trade facts with, the part that is music and memory. She couldn't place where she'd first heard the tune outside of that house. She tried to tell herself she must have once heard it on a record, maybe an old radio, maybe her grandmother, but she couldn't trace it. More troubling came later. Hannah started humming under her breath at odd times, when we were in a grocery line, when we sat in a movie theater, in lectures she didn't care about. Not full songs, just the little fragment, the same slow rise and fall like someone rocking a chair on a porch. Once, weeks after the house had been demolished into a neat pile of timbers and plaster, she sat in the car while I pumped gas and hummed it without looking at me. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, and she said quietly, "Do you ever get the feeling a place will keep a piece of you?" I told her yes, because I had my own memories that still knocked at the inside of my skull. But there was also something else, a small proof that made even the paperwork inadequate. When Hannah returned to the lot where the house had been torn down, she found a small indent in the soil where the porch used to be. In that hollow, untouched by the machines, was a loop of frayed string. Not much, not meaningful on the surface. But Hannah picked it up, and the string smelled faintly of that same sour milk and old metal that the parlor had worn like a layer. The string was probably nothing. It could have been windblown. It could have been the residue of someone passing through long before demolition. But for us it became another stitch in a seam that would not stay closed. Hannah stopped treating abandoned houses like a hobby after that. She still read about them. She still went to lectures and small tours, but she stopped breaking plywood. The rhythm of her steps changed. Where once she moved through places like a historian uncovering artifacts, she began to leave things where they lay. When she hums now, she calls it hers, and shrugs me off with a laugh that is more careful than before. I don't say much, because I think she knows the way to keep her life whole is to refuse to trade memories with places that will not return them. The third house kept doing its own slow work on me. Time keeps draping new coats of ordinariness over the scene. The new family who moved in, the mail routes re-established, lawns trimmed. But the night after the old man's son returned with boxes, and that buzz of moving bodies, Joel and I decided to see what would happen if somebody watched the house the way the house had watched us. We sat in my truck across the street, with the windows cracked, a thermos of coffee gone cold in the cup holder. The streetlight hummed. At first everything was typical. A television glowed in the living room window, the kind of blue light that makes skin look poor. Curtains moved as boxes were elbowed into place. We watched a man, tall, younger than I expected, walk from room to room, stopping to look at things that belonged to another man's life. He moved quickly and efficiently, not the slow, careful sweeping of someone occupying memory, but a practical, cashier's pace. Joel joked about the new guy, about how he probably had a better lawnmower. We laughed too loud. We were old enough now that bravado was thinner and less useful. Then something small and odd happened. The kitchen light came on and then the hallway, and the back porch lamp clicked on with the same rhythm we'd heard as a knock weeks before. 3 beats. A pause. Joel swore he felt his skin tingle, like a static shock across his forearm. The son didn't notice, or at least he didn't look out the window. Maybe he was inside, naked to the history, as if it were just boxes and no ghosts. Or maybe he was part of a pattern that none of us could name. We kept watching. The living room window, the same one we'd seen the silhouette in earlier, held a shadow for a second. Then another. Not two people, too precise to be that, but two movements. One seemed to cross the room at a normal pace. The other was slower, like someone reliving a memory on loop. It stopped at the window and then, in a motion that slivered across my chest, it lifted a hand. Not a wave, not anything friendly. It was a small raise of the palm, fingers splayed like someone brushing their forehead. The kind of motion you make when you first see who is outside and you pretend you don't. Joel swore later that the figure looked straight at us. I don't remember whether that was true. I remember only the way my throat narrowed into a dry knot, and the truck's dashboard looked like a small island beneath us. The son turned his head as if he had felt us, or maybe he saw the movement in the window. He looked out, and for a horrible, immediate second he seemed to know. His face hardened. He walked to the door and opened it a sliver. A wordless exchange passed. A look like he was telling us to go away, that this was not for us. He stepped outside and the air around him seemed unchanged. He didn't approach the truck. He didn't say anything we could make out. He simply stared until we finally, properly, stupidly left. Sometimes when people tell stories about the supernatural, they try to dramatize the moment, add thunder and the smell of ozone. This wasn't like that. It was small and human, and felt in a way more invasive because of it. The house had not raised its roof and shouted. It had been slow and patient and had used the ordinary. A light switched on, a shadow at the window, a hand. It was as if it kept a ledger and entered our names when we left them open. We kept watch for a while after that night. Joel and I took turns staying up and seeing the street through a crack of blinds. The neighborhood settled into a version of calm that is false in its own way. The sound of recycling bins, someone mowing. The house sold eventually. The new people painted the shutters and bought a driveway toy for their kid. We never felt the same rightness looking at it. Something private had happened there. Whatever it was, the fact that multiple of us had seen parts of it kept the memory stubborn. Validation for frightening things is not comforting. It is proof that your senses can be trusted. It also means there is now something else in the ledger, more witnesses. What I keep thinking about now, years removed from the nights and the smell of rot and the hiss of a Subaru's tires on gravel, is how little control we have over what sticks. We were young, and for a while that gave us courage. It also made the world feel like a set of dares. The truth I keep coming back to is more boring and more honest. Abandoned places are repositories. They hold the small habits of human life like dust collects on a mantle. When a life stops, the evidence lingers. It collects in empty chairs, in a lullaby hummed without memory, in a shadow that looks like someone moving from doorway to window and then goes impossible. We found traces of people. We found traces of the things people leave behind. Melodies, strings, footprints. Not tidy ghost stories, but messy human leftovers. That mess refuses to be neat. You can tell yourself the military village woman was a squatter. You can write the rocking chair off as a deranged occupant with a fondness for nursery music. You can say the silhouette was a trick of light. Those are reasonable things to say. They make sense in the daylight, in reports and records and formalities. They are not, however, complete. None of those explanations touch the odd details. The fresh planks that weren't there moments after we left, the scrap of melody that had no origin in any of our backgrounds, the slow hand at the window when nobody should have been there. I keep telling these stories because they still feel unfinished. Not because there's a ghost in need of a story, but because there's an unease that sits in the bones of my memory and refuses to be soothed by paperwork or the demolition of a building. If anything binds them together, it's that sense of being out of depth. It's the posture we took, leaning forward, thinking we could name what we found, and the small humiliations after. We ran. We hummed songs we didn't remember learning. We watched a house like it was a thing we could make give up its secrets. So what to do with that unfinishedness? Part of me thinks the proper adult thing is to leave it alone, to respect limits, and to not go looking for things you can't explain. Part of me, the one that still hears footsteps when a house settles, wants the truth, some tidy answer that makes sense on paper. Mostly, I accept both, that some nights will live as questions, and that is a kind of answer, if you let it be. If you've got a story like this, something you saw in a place men and time had forgotten, tell it in the comments. Tell me which of these three stuck with you the most. The woman in the black dress, the rocking chair that hummed, or the silhouette that crossed a room. And if you want more of these kinds of stories, true things I kept for a long time and am finally letting out, subscribe. I promise to keep the caution loud. Don't go trespassing because you want a story. Be smarter than we were. I still wake sometimes to the sensation of a chair rocking in an empty house, and for reasons I can't name, I instinctively check the back seat of my car. I still wonder whether those small, stubborn scraps of memory are what the places owed us, or what we stole from them. Either way, they stay with me. They won't let me sleep the way they used to. They shouldn't. Maybe that's the right punishment for being young and reckless and curious all at once. Maybe it's simply what happens when places keep pieces of people long after the people are gone.